The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of his private study. His usually confident shoulders sagged under an invisible weight that had been growing heavier each day. The official announcement would come soon, but for now, the secret burned in his chest like a physical pain. Princess Catherine found him there, as she always did during his darkest moments. Her footsteps were soft on the marble floor, but he recognized the gentle rhythm immediately. She had been his anchor for 7 years of marriage, through every storm that royal life had thrown at them. Today would test that bond more than ever before. "The children are asking questions," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him. Their twins, Prince James and Princess Emma, were only 6 years old, but they possessed the sharp intuition that seemed to run in the royal bloodline. They can sense something is wrong. Alexander's jaw tightened. The medical reports were spread across his desk, each page containing words that felt like small daggers. The rare genetic condition had remained dormant until now, but the specialists were clear about what lay ahead. His voice, the same voice that had addressed millions during times of national celebration and crisis, would gradually fade to nothing. "How do I tell them that Daddy won't be able to read them bedtime stories much longer?" The words came out as barely a whisper, and Catherine felt her heart break at the vulnerability in his tone. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become their silent language of support. "We'll find a way," she said, though uncertainty flickered in her green eyes. "We always do." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Alexander had been known throughout the kingdom as the voice of hope. During the devastating floods 3 years ago, his radio addresses had kept spirits alive in the darkest communities. When economic uncertainty gripped the nation, his speeches in Parliament had restored confidence in their future. His voice had been his greatest gift to his people, and soon it would be gone. Dr. Harrison had been gentle but direct during yesterday's consultation. "Your Royal Highness, the condition will progress gradually over the next 6 to 18 months. We can slow it down, but we cannot stop it." The physician's words echoed in Alexander's mind as he watched a gardener tend to Catherine's beloved rose garden below. Catherine studied her husband's profile, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders carried tension like armor. She had fallen in love with many things about him, but his voice had been one of the first. The way he spoke to children during hospital visits, soft and patient. The strength in his tone during difficult cabinet meetings. The tenderness when he whispered her name in the quiet moments before sleep. "Remember our wedding day?" she asked suddenly, surprising him with the seemingly random question. Alexander turned to face her fully for the first time that morning. "Of course. You were the most beautiful bride in the history of the kingdom." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth despite everything. "You forgot your vows," she reminded him with a gentle laugh. "You stood there in front of 2 billion people watching worldwide, and your mind went completely blank." He chuckled softly at the memory. "I was terrified. The Archbishop was staring at me. Your father looked like he might challenge me to a duel, and I couldn't remember a single word I'd practiced for months. But then you did something that no royal had ever done before," Catherine continued, her eyes sparkling with the memory. "You threw away the speech and spoke from your heart. You told me and everyone watching exactly how you felt without any fancy words or formal language." The memory washed over Alexander like warm sunlight. He had taken her hands in his, looked directly into her eyes, and simply said what was in his heart. No protocol, no prepared remarks, just truth. The silence in Westminster Abbey had been deafening for those few seconds before he began to speak. "That moment changed everything," Catherine said softly. "Not just for us, but for how people saw the royal family. You showed them that behind all the ceremony and tradition, We're human beings who love and fear and hope just like everyone else. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a small loosening of the tight knot of despair that had taken residence there. But this is different, Catherine. This isn't about choosing to be vulnerable. This is about losing the ability to be heard at all. She moved closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Your voice isn't just the sound you make when you speak. It's who you are, how you lead, the way you love our children and our people. That voice will never be silenced. The words hung between them as Alexander processed what she was saying. Outside, the palace grounds buzzed with the usual activity of staff preparing for the day's official duties. Soon, their private secretary would arrive with the schedule, reporters would gather for the afternoon briefing, and the machinery of royal duty would demand their attention. But in this moment, in the quiet sanctuary of their shared understanding, something profound was taking shape. Catherine could see it in the way Alexander's posture began to straighten, in the subtle change in his breathing. The man who had spent his life finding the right words was beginning to understand that sometimes the most powerful communication happened in silence. The doctors want to brief the communications team next week, Alexander said finally. They're recommending we prepare the public gradually, maybe start by reducing my speaking engagements. Catherine nodded, her practical mind already working through the logistics, even as her heart ached for what they were facing. We'll need to think carefully about how we approach this. The people love you, Alexander. They'll want to support you through this. Or they'll lose faith in a king who can't speak for them, he replied, old fears surfacing. Then we'll show them that leadership comes in many forms, she said with a certainty that surprised them both. We'll show them that strength doesn't always have to be loud. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the study door. Their children's voices carried through the heavy wood, asking if they could come in for their morning cuddles. It was a family tradition that had survived even the busiest royal schedules. Alexander looked at Catherine, and in that look passed all the fear, love, and determination that would carry them through the trials ahead. Together, they would have to find new ways to be heard, new ways to serve, and new ways to show their children that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in the words we speak, but in the grace with which we face silence. The door opened, and Prince James and Princess Emma burst in with the unstoppable energy of 6-year-olds, their laughter filling the room with light. As Alexander knelt to embrace them, Catherine saw the future stretching before them, uncertain but not hopeless. Whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, together. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere in the palace press room felt electric with tension. Catherine sat beside Alexander at the polished wooden podium, her hands folded calmly in her lap while her heart raced beneath her composed exterior. The gathered journalists sensed something significant was coming. Royal press conferences called with only 24 hours' notice were rare and always momentous. Alexander's voice was still strong, though those closest to him could detect the slight hoarseness that had begun to creep in during longer conversations. The medical team had assured them they had time. But each day brought subtle changes that only Catherine and their closest staff noticed. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, his words carrying across the hushed room with the authority that had defined his public speaking for over a decade. Princess Catherine and I have asked you here today to share some personal news that will affect our royal duties in the coming months. The cameras clicked rapidly as photographers captured every micro-expression. Catherine felt the familiar weight of global attention, but today it felt different. Heavier somehow, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I have been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that will gradually affect my ability to speak, Alexander continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. While this news is difficult for our family, I want to assure you that it will not diminish my commitment to serving our nation and Commonwealth realms. The silence that followed was profound. Veteran royal correspondents who had covered decades of royal scandals, celebrations, and crises sat stunned. This wasn't a political controversy or personal indiscretion. This was raw human vulnerability being shared with unprecedented openness. Sarah Mitchell, the BBC's royal correspondent, was the first to raise her hand. "Your Royal Highness, can you tell us more about your prognosis and how this will affect your official duties?" Alexander nodded toward Catherine, a prearranged signal that she would field the medical questions. She leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and compassionate. "The condition will progress gradually over the next 6 to 18 months. Alexander will continue his full schedule of engagements for as long as possible, with adjustments made as needed. We are working with constitutional experts to ensure continuity of his roles and responsibilities." The questions came quickly after that. How long had they known? What treatments were available? How were the children coping? Catherine and Alexander answered each inquiry with remarkable grace, their unity and strength evident to everyone watching. But it was the final question that created the moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media and news broadcasts around the world. James Thornton, a young reporter from The Independent, raised his hand hesitantly. "Your Royal Highness, you've always been known for your powerful speeches and your ability to comfort the nation during difficult times. How are you personally coping with the prospect of losing that?" For the first time during the press conference, Alexander's composure wavered slightly. His eyes dropped to the podium for several seconds, seconds that felt like hours to those watching. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My voice," he began, then stopped. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Catherine reached over and placed her hand on his arm, not caring that the gesture would be analyzed and discussed endlessly. Alexander looked at her, drawing strength from her steady gaze, then back at the assembled press. "My voice has been my way of serving you all, of trying to bring comfort during disasters, hope during uncertainty, and celebration during our triumphs. The thought of losing that is—" His voice caught slightly. "It's terrifying." The honesty was breathtaking. Members of the press, hardened by years of political spin and calculated royal statements, found themselves genuinely moved by the raw emotion in the room. "But," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger, "Catherine reminded me recently that a voice is more than the sounds we make. It's how we choose to live, how we treat others, and how we use whatever abilities we have to serve something greater than ourselves." Catherine squeezed his arm gently, her own eyes glistening with emotion. "I may lose the ability to speak to you all in the traditional way," Alexander said, "but I will never stop trying to be heard. Princess Catherine and I are committed to showing that leadership, service, and love don't require volume. Sometimes the most important messages are shared in silence." As the press conference ended, the couple left the podium together, their exit watched by millions around the world. They had no way of knowing that within hours, hashtags like "Our Royal Strength" and "Silent Service" would be trending globally, or that their honest vulnerability would spark conversations about disability, leadership, and courage in living rooms, offices, and schools across dozens of countries. Back in their private apartments, Alexander collapsed into his favorite armchair with the exhaustion that comes after intense public exposure. Catherine knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "You were magnificent," she whispered. "Absolutely magnificent." "I felt like I was going to fall apart," he admitted, leaning his forehead against hers. "When that reporter asked about losing my voice, I couldn't breathe for a moment." "But you didn't fall apart. You shared your heart, and I think people saw something in that moment that they needed to see." The children found them there an hour later, curled together in the large chair like they used to do during the early days of their marriage. Princess Emma climbed onto Alexander's lap while Prince James settled against Catherine's side. "Daddy, Mrs. Peterson at school said she saw you on television," Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone that 6-year-olds use for everything. "She said you were very brave." Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Did she?" "What do you think about that?" Emma considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I think you're always brave. Like when you check under our beds for monsters, even though you're scared of spiders." The simple wisdom of a child's perspective brought the first genuine laughter Alexander had experienced in weeks. "You're right, sweetheart. Sometimes being brave just means doing something even when you're scared." Prince James looked up at his mother with curious eyes. "Mummy, will Daddy still be able to sing us lullabies?" Catherine's breath caught, but before she could answer, Alexander spoke softly. "I'll sing to you for as long as I can, James. And when I can't anymore, maybe we'll find new ways to share music together. Maybe you and Emma can sing to me." The twins accepted this with the remarkable adaptability of children, already moving on to discussions of their upcoming school play and whether they could have ice cream before dinner. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine found Alexander in his study reading messages that had poured in from around the world. Letters from people sharing their own struggles with illness, messages from disability advocates praising his openness, and hundreds of notes from ordinary citizens expressing their support and love. "Listen to this one," Alexander said, his voice soft with wonder. He held up a handwritten letter from a teenage girl in Australia. "She says that watching our press conference helped her find the courage to tell her parents about her hearing loss. She'd been hiding it for months, afraid they would think less of her." Catherine read over his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "Alexander, do you see what's happening? Your vulnerability gave her permission to be vulnerable too." As they sat together reading message after message, both began to understand that their greatest challenge might also become their greatest gift. In sharing their fear and uncertainty, they had opened a door for others to do the same. The silence that had once terrified them was becoming a new kind of voice, one that spoke not through words, but through courage, honesty, and the radical act of remaining open-hearted in the face of loss. Outside their window, the lights of the city twinkled like stars, each one representing someone who had been touched by their story. The royal silence was no longer just theirs to bear. It had become a shared space where millions could find the courage to face their own fears with grace. 8 months had passed since that transformative press conference, and the Great Hall of Kensington Palace had never felt more alive with purpose. 500 people filled the ornate space. Disability advocates, medical researchers, young people from across the Commonwealth, and families who had been touched by the royal couple's journey. Today marked the inaugural ceremony of the Silent Voices Foundation, an organization born from the overwhelming response to Alexander and Catherine's story. Alexander sat on the stage beside Catherine, his hands resting calmly in his lap. His voice had faded to whispers 3 months ago, and last month, even those whispers had become too difficult to sustain. But as Catherine looked out at the assembled crowd, she had never felt his presence more powerfully. He communicated now through gentle touches, expressive eyes, and a smile that could light up any room. The twins, now 7 years old, had become remarkable translators of their father's silent language. Princess Emma bounded onto the stage with the confidence that only children possess, carrying a tablet device that had become Alexander's new voice. "Daddy wants to welcome everyone to our palace," Emma announced to the crowd, her clear voice carrying easily through the hall. "He says thank you for coming to celebrate all the different ways people can be heard." A warm murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Prince James joined his sister. Both children completely natural in their role as their father's interpreters. Over the months, they had developed an intuitive understanding of Alexander's expressions and gestures that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Catherine stepped to the podium, her confidence as a public speaker having grown exponentially over the past year. When my husband and I first shared our story, we had no idea it would touch so many hearts around the world, she began, her voice strong and clear. We were simply a family facing an uncertain future, trying to find courage in the midst of fear. She paused, looking back at Alexander, who gave her an encouraging nod. The subtle communication between them had become a beautiful dance, each anticipating the other's needs and thoughts with remarkable precision. What we discovered, Catherine continued, is that millions of people everywhere have felt silenced by disability, illness, trauma, or simply by a world that doesn't always know how to listen. Your letters, your stories, your courage in sharing your own struggles have taught us that voice comes in countless forms. In the third row, Maria Santos sat with tears streaming down her face. 3 months ago, she had written to the royal couple about her son Diego, who had been born deaf. For years, she had grieved the voice she thought he would never have. But watching Alexander's transformation, seeing how his family had learned to communicate through love rather than words, had changed everything. Diego, now 8, was thriving in his sign language classes and had even taught some basic signs to his hearing siblings. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the neurologist who had first delivered Alexander's diagnosis, watched from the medical professionals section with profound amazement. She had treated hundreds of patients with similar conditions, but none had ever transformed their loss into such widespread hope. The foundation being launched today would fund research into communication disorders while simultaneously supporting families navigating similar journeys. Alexander's former speechwriter, Robert Hayes, sat near the back of the hall with a notebook in his lap. For 15 years, he had crafted the prince's most important addresses, always searching for the perfect words to capture complex emotions and ideas. Today, he was witnessing communication that transcended anything he had ever written. Alexander's silence spoke volumes about resilience, acceptance, and the power of human connection. Catherine's voice brought everyone's attention back to the ceremony. Today, we're not just launching a foundation. We're celebrating a new understanding of what it means to be heard. My husband may no longer speak in the traditional sense, but his message has never been clearer. She gestured toward a large screen that descended from the ceiling. On it appeared a video montage of the past 8 months, Alexander working with sign language interpreters, participating in silent meditation sessions with trauma survivors, and engaging with children who used alternative communication methods. In every scene, his presence was magnetic, his communication profound, despite the absence of words. The final clip showed Alexander at a children's hospital the previous month. A young girl named Sophie, who had lost her voice to cancer treatments, had been afraid to interact with anyone. The video captured the moment when Alexander sat beside her bed, took her small hand in his, and simply smiled. Without exchanging a single spoken word, they began to draw pictures together. By the end of the visit, Sophie was laughing silently, and for the first time in months, her mother saw hope return to her daughter's eyes. As the video ended, Alexander stood slowly and walked to the podium. The hall fell into complete silence, 500 people instinctively understanding that something significant was about to happen. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes taking in faces young and old, some in wheelchairs, others with service dogs, many showing visible signs of their own struggles and triumphs. Then, using the sign language he had been learning, Alexander began to communicate. His hands moved with careful precision, each gesture deliberate and full of meaning. Princess Emma stepped forward to provide voice interpretation, but her translation was hardly necessary. Everyone could feel the power of what Alexander was sharing. "He says," Emma began, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years, that losing his voice taught him how to truly listen. He says that every person here has a voice that matters, whether it comes from hands or hearts or eyes or actions. Alexander continued signing, and James joined his sister at the microphone. Daddy wants everyone to know that silence isn't empty. It's full of love, full of understanding, and full of all the ways we can care for each other without words. The standing ovation began spontaneously, growing until the entire hall was on their feet. But what made the moment truly extraordinary was that half the applause came not from clapping hands, but from the visual applause of the deaf community, raised hands waving in appreciation, a sight that brought tears to eyes throughout the audience. Catherine joined Alexander at the podium, their children flanking them on either side. As photographers captured the moment, none of them needed to speak for their message to resonate around the world. They were a family that had faced loss together and discovered that love could translate any language, bridge any silence, and touch any heart willing to listen. In the months that followed, videos of Alexander's sign language address would be shared millions of times across social media platforms. Schools would begin teaching their students about different forms of communication. The hashtag #ListenWithYourHeart would inspire a global movement celebrating neurodiversity and alternative communication methods. But perhaps most importantly, countless families facing their own challenges would find hope in the example of a royal family that had shown the world that losing one's voice didn't mean losing one's power to inspire, to lead, and to love. The royal silence that had once seemed like an ending had become a beginning. Not just for Alexander and Catherine, but for millions of people who finally understood that being heard was not about the volume of your voice, but about the depth of your courage to remain authentically human in a world that desperately needed that reminder. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to mingle, Alexander caught Catherine's eye across the room. In that look passed everything that words could never capture: gratitude for the journey they had shared, pride in the children who had grown wise beyond their years, and hope for all the silent voices that would find their power in the days to come. Their love story had become the world's story, and their silence had become everyone's song.